Have you ever had a time in your life when you've just felt physically, emotionally, maybe even spiritually spent? You know, one of those times, maybe it's because something happened, maybe it's because of a number of things that seem to happen in a row, and you're just wiped out. You feel like you're just barely holding on by your fingertips. You know, this week I overheard a conversation, and a woman was saying, I just need a day for myself. I'm always taking care of someone else. I just needed a day to myself. Now, you know, someone could say a comment like that, and you think, wow, that sounds pretty selfish. But it's an issue that she gives of herself day in and day out, and she just needed a day to care for herself. You know, she's been under a lot of stress. She's been on an emotional roller coaster, and just physically, emotionally, spiritually, she's worn out. Can anyone relate to that? Is there anyone who can't relate to that, you know, at some point? You know, this condition ebbs and flows in all of our lives, but as a pastor, my concern is that I'm seeing more and more people living perpetually in that state. In that state of just feeling physically, emotionally, and spiritually worn out. I believe that this state of emotional and physical exhaustion was probably a good description of what was going on with the women that first Easter morning as they were coming to the tomb. You know, we don't know exactly where the women are from, but chances are they were probably from Galilee. They were probably from the same area that Jesus and his disciples were that had traveled to Jerusalem for the Passover. Now think about it. If you traveled a family for Christmas or Thanksgiving, you know, you travel for a few days and stay in their home for the fun of festivities and how tired you are in the process. Or maybe you're the one that's opened your home to having company for several days around the holidays. Well, this is what these women are experiencing. They've traveled to Jerusalem. They're involved in lots of celebrations. They're worn out from the celebrations. As they arrived in town last Sunday, you know, there was Jesus' triumphal entry. You know, they were a part of the crowds that were cheering, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And there was an adrenaline rush as they were a part of that celebrating crowd. And then they were also in Jerusalem when they heard about Jesus driving the money changers out of the temple and saying, the temple, my Father's house, is to be a house of prayer. You know, at that point, they recognized the tension that was beginning to grow between Jesus and the religious leaders. And then there's a good chance that these women may have been in the upper room for the Last Supper. Now, we always think of the Last Supper as being a time that Jesus is with his 12 disciples, the 12 that are closest to him, but there's probably a good chance that there were other followers with them, and a good chance that some of those other followers were women. Maybe these very same women who have gone to the tomb. Well, when the disciples and Jesus went to the Garden of Gethsemane, we don't know exactly what the women did, but given the culture of the day, there's probably a good chance that they stayed behind in the banquet hall and helped clean things up. And probably when Jesus was arrested, one of the disciples that went running came back to the upper room and told the women that Jesus had been arrested. You know, after all the week's activities, after all the exhaustion that comes with preparing a Passover meal and celebrating it, chances are that Thursday night the women didn't get a whole lot of sleep because they were worrying about Jesus. And then on Friday, they followed Jesus around when he appeared before Pilate. They saw him be beaten. They watched him be led away to Golgotha. They watched him be crucified. And it's probably these same women that were a part of the group that took his body and laid it in a tomb. Can you imagine a week like that? Can you imagine 7 days of your life like that? And now, as they come to Sunday morning, as they come to the tomb, they are just physically, emotionally, and spiritually wiped out. They can barely hold it together, and now they come to the tomb and find that the stone has been rolled away and that the tomb is empty. Now, each of the four Gospels talk about this story, talk about the women going to the tomb. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the books of the Bible that tell the story of Jesus' life and ministry, his death and resurrection. And there are different stories, different vignettes out of Jesus' life that is shared in each of the Gospels. There are very few stories that we find in all four Gospels. For example, the birth narrative, the story of Jesus' birth, we only find that in two of the Gospels. But in all four of the Gospels, we find the story of Jesus' crucifixion, and we also find the story of his resurrection, of the women going to the tomb. Now, each of the Gospels tell the story in a little bit different way. And because they tell it in a little bit different way, there are some people who say, well, it must not be reliable. It must not be true since each of the Gospel writers tell it in a little bit different way. Well, they tell the details a little bit differently, but they all agree on the fact that the tomb was empty on that first Easter morning. For example, Matthew says, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. In the Gospel of Mark, it says, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, the Mary of mother of James, and Salome brought spices so they could go to anoint Jesus' body. Now, Jewish law forbid that you do any preparation of a dead body on the Sabbath. And the Sabbath began at sundown on Friday night and went till sundown on Saturday. So as Jesus died on the cross on Friday afternoon, when they took him down, it was probably barely before sundown that they got his body in the tomb. But as the Sabbath began, they could not prepare his body for burial. They could not put the spices, the embalming spices on his body. So that's why they were going back on Sunday morning to do that. You know, Mark says that when the Sabbath was over, that meant that they could have gone as early as sundown on Saturday night. But as he said that as soon as the Sabbath was over, it very well could have been talking about going at the break of dawn on Sunday morning. You know, Luke tells us that it was on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, when the women took spices that they had prepared. Now, Luke doesn't give us names or number of women. He just says that the women went to the tomb. John says early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. Now, the gospel writer stated that Mary Magdalene went to the tomb, but also in the passage, Mary's quoted as saying, we don't know where they have taken Jesus' body, indicating that there were others that were with Mary. The details are different. One gospel says there was two, one says there were three, one doesn't give a number, another one just gives a number of, or gives the name of one woman. One says that it happened while it was still dark, and others said that the dawn was just beginning to break. Even though the details are a little bit differently, they're all describing the same event. In The Case for Christ, Lee Strobel says, with these multiple and independent accounts, no historian would disregard the evidence just because of secondary discrepancies. He cites a secular example of Hannibal crossing the Alps to attack Rome, for which there are two historically incompatible and irreconcilable stories of what happened. Yet no classical historian doubts the fact that Hannibal did make mount such a campaign. Hannibal's crossing is a non-biblical illustration of a story which has discrepancies in secondary details, but it doesn't discredit the fact that it historically really happened.